Pavilion, The Way Things Were. Atish Tasir will be in conversation with Ranveer Shah. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Those of you who haven't read The Way Things Were should grab a copy right after this session. I haven't read all of Atish's book. I read his first book and this latest one, and I have to say it's a tremendous piece of work. So congratulations, and I'm delighted that the curators put me on this panel, even if it is the last, put us on this panel, even if it's the last one, simply because I had the privilege of reading this wonderful piece of work. To start with, tell us a bit about, before we come to this book, tell us a bit about how you got into writing. Everybody knows about the famous Mother, but was it that, or was it just, your own interest?
Firstly, the mother's a journalist, so I was always doing something different, and it was, I suppose if there was a literary gene, it was my grandfather, who was an Urdu poet. But you know, these things only matter up to a point. I've always wanted to be a writer. I was 19 or 17 when I started my first full-length novel. I think I had, I'd kind of gone the distance of writing a book, had a full manuscript, age 19. It was one of those books that ends up in the drawer, just as well probably. But as soon as I knew that I could make a life with it, it was all I wanted to do. What more can I tell you about it?
Tell us about the process of the first one, Stranger to History, and you know, it had a lot to do with identity, your coming to terms with who you were, visiting the sort of Islamic worlds across and then traveling. And
well, the two things. One is that there was a kind of the intellectual curiosity that prompted that book was one thing. There was also, I was also coming out of actually a failure of 5 or 6 years of failing to write a novel, not understanding how fiction worked, kind of falling flat on my face a few times. And so I personally at that point thought I just need to get out of this job at Time magazine and in some ways like be my own man as far as writing goes. And I thought, well, if I can't write a novel, let me try to write, let me try to get a little bit of training in non-fiction and see if I can work my way back to fiction. And it was a very interesting time. And the week that I quit Time magazine, or 2 weeks later, the London bombings happened. And my editor, I found myself for the first time without a job in journalism at a time when you really wanted a job in journalism. And I traveled up to Beeston, where the bombers had come from, and I'd been for the last year or so quite close to what was happening with radical Islam in those northern parts of England, and came back and wrote a story about a man called Hassan Bhatt, which Prospect magazine ran on its cover. And I sent the story to my father, and I was quite pleased with it. And I got back an enraged email. And he was Pakistani. I'd rediscovered him as a sort of young man at the age of 22 or so. And I couldn't understand that this person who was in some ways not a believer, not religious, and yet I felt that the way that he was offended, the nature of the offense, had all the force of faith. There was like, in some ways, that political and historical identity, it seemed it was almost more important than faith. It had all the force of faith. And in a sense, like the kind of man he became was sort of the seed of my curiosity. What I was traveling to find out was that what part of somebody's like political and historical identity was governed by Islam. So that was the thing that I was looking for, and that was the journey that Stranger to History became.
And coming now to The Way Things Were, set against the three sort of important political events of the emergency, the Sikh riots of '84, as well as the Babri Masjid, is the story of Toby, Uma, the protagonist Kanda, and you know, all that happens to their lives. How did this come to be, and how much of it is at a sort of congruence of literature meets life? Because there's always that.
Oh, Ranveer, what a hard question. What am I to say? Ask the question in a different way.
You answer it in whichever way you're comfortable.
I don't know if I totally understand it. Are you asking me? Ask it again. I really don't know what you're asking.
Given that these three historical moments in Delhi occurred, perhaps you were part of it, perhaps you were not. Why did you choose to set the story of the way things were through this time?
I understand.
And how much of it is a personal therapy in the story or a personal sharing?
Don't use that word, not personal therapy. Not catharsis, it was too much work to be therapy or catharsis.
Okay.
The period to me was very, I think I felt often that period that comes just before you're born, in any way, already exerts a kind of drama. It already has a sort of power on your imagination. It happened that for me, that 1975 year, I knew was a landmark year. I thought of it as the year of kind of disenchantment with the Indian idea. And then I was fascinated by these very dark years in the 80s. When I was my first memory was of that time. I'd come from England as a little baby, and my first word was hi, and my first sentence was Indira Gandhi, hi, hi. So it was an incredibly political time, incredibly charged, very violent. And it ended with the demolition of the Babri Masjid. In some ways, that was like one of those first television memories. And I thought that this a lot about how our present situation was, that time was kind of embryonic in some ways, 75 to 92. And in my mind, when I was thinking of it as a novel, I thought that's quite nice. It opens with this man coming back in 1975 who's devoted to the idea of India, in some ways almost blinded to the reality of India because of his relationship with classical India. And then you take him through that very dark time in the 80s. And you can see that section, it's enfolded by night and fog on both sides. And then you come out into the Babri Masjid and you can really see the corruption of Toby's dream. You can see that he has this vision of classical India, and suddenly he's awakened to the reality of the place. And he had a kind of dream of Renaissance. But when that sort of Renaissance or that rebirth or something comes about, what a rough thing it is, you know? And he's in no position. He doesn't have
the dream actually becomes a nightmare.
It becomes a nightmare, and it hurts him more. That hurts him more than anything. So for me, that working in a fictional sense, it was not difficult to think of that time as the time I would write about.
Do you want to share with us what Toby's like and read a bit from the book?
Let me introduce you to Toby. This is an early. This will give you a sense also of when I speak about this vision that he's blinded by. Toby looked a foreigner in India. It was not just the light eyes, nor the fair skin and floppy blondish brown hair. It was that above and beyond these things, there was an innocence, a naivete in his face that gave him away as someone who could not have grown up in India, not at least in North India, where even the stray dogs had a knowing and watchful look. It was strange. There was never a man who knew more about India and yet knew India less than Toby. He was like one of those men who fall in love with the idea of a woman while all the time insulating themselves from her reality. At Oxford, a student of his, a girl from Bengal, had said, "Professor Ketu, it's as if you rather wish modern India didn't exist." And laughing, he had replied, "Don't we all?" Toby's deep knowledge of classical India made the real India remote, made it more concept than reality. For there are few places where the past continues as seamlessly into the present as India, and yet where the people are so unaware of it. All around him, Toby saw the remnants of the Sanskritic past. There in the names that were compounds, the analysis of which he would do silently in his head. There in the low-lying colonies that had dressed themselves up in grand names from the epics, to which his mind could not help but go. There in the nursery down the road that had named itself after Indra's capital, or in the chemists that had taken for themselves the name of the twins who were physicians to the gods. And there in the people's language, which even in English adopted words like only and just, to compensate for lost particles of stress and emphasis, words such as he and Eva and Khalu that had come down to them from Sanskrit. Everywhere he looked, Toby could see, under layer upon haphazard layer of borrowed and vernacular language, the glorious and systematic bedrock of Sanskrit. It held for him all the frustration and excitement of seeing beneath a thick encroachment of slum and shanty the preserved remains of a far grander city, of gridded streets, sophisticated sewage systems, of magnificent civic architecture. But thrilling as it was to find extant around him the language he had dedicated his life to, it was a private thrill. For as much as the language limped on, as much as it was still visible under the Vulgate, all awareness of it had gone. It was not apparent to those living among it. It was there in the form of ruins and nothing more. The people, moreover, had no means to assess its beauty, and this could produce either embarrassment or false pride. The knowledge of decay made Toby seem passive when it came to India. The country already existed to so large an extent, existed for him privately in his mind and imagination, that he let all of it become illusory, all shadows on the wall of a cave, all a pale emanation of some far grander and irrecoverable reality. He was like a man who, having known the Forum in the days of Trajan, returns to see it as spolia in people's houses.
Lovely, lovely. Toby is the Maharaja of Kal Surya Ketu, and he falls in love with Skanda's mother, Uma, and then the story unfolds. Toby, of course, as Atish has read, is a Sanskrit scholar, and his son, Skanda, is given that in transmission over the years growing up. And part of the whole story is set against the whole backdrop or foreground of language and its transmission, as to, instead of actually giving him a privileged life, it's the language that he gives him. So how did this Sanskrit become a part of you, the novel? Did you study it? I read an interview of all the magazines on a flight 3 days ago, where you talk about if there is a time to learn Sanskrit, it's in your 20s and not in your 50s. So tell us about your affair with Sanskrit.
My affair with Sanskrit. Ranveer, it began in a very simple way, which was that I found myself in a particular geographical location, trying to begin a career as a writer, and found that like various historical things had occurred that didn't allow me to go back into my literary past. There was the past of it started with the fact that my grandfather was an Urdu poet and I couldn't read his poetry. And that was how Urdu sort of entered my life. And then very soon after, it was so strange that I was in an area where literary production had occurred for over 1,000 years. And the way that a certain kind of like English post-colonial life had left me, I was not directed in that. I was not even encouraged to look at what had come before in that same place. And actually, the desire for Sanskrit came out of this very simple wish to just hear a voice from classical India. Like that first time when I was sitting and I heard this Brihadashva Ovacha, Brihadashva spake. And suddenly I thought, wow, all of these stories, all of this work was all done in this same area. It's part, and so that was how it began. And in the beginning, I just thought it would give me like I wanted just a little sensibility in some ways. And as it started to unfold, it gave me much more than that, because it was to know it is in some ways to be connected to such a magnificent story. It's so beautiful, the story of Sanskrit, of this emergence of this language with these shared origins with other languages, the way that it stays in a kind of liturgical role for 1,000 years, and then suddenly a moment occurs that gives it a life as a language of politics and statecraft, and for 1,000 years it blooms as a literary language, and it was such a suggestive thing, Never mind the stuff with Cognates and all that, which was so much fun anyway.
So tell us now about the Cognates, since you brought it up, which was a lot of fun, even for the reader.
Yeah.
And why did you put that in? Because that was something, as a writer, that excited you, and you put that into the narrative.
Well,
because it comes up as sort of wonderful surprises for the reader.
Yeah. It was happening to me in a real sense. Like I was reading the Kumara Sambhava, and reading it with the commentary of Malinatha. My Sanskrit teacher, the objective was, he said, I want to get you to a point where the commentarial tradition, where the people who've written about Sanskrit can teach you the great works of Sanskrit literature. So I don't have to teach you the Kumara Sambhava. If you want, Malinatha, who was working 1,000 years later, and literally in those commentaries, that paragraph of commentary under the verse, you can actually see the ghost of the tutorial. You can see somebody under a tree picking up a sentence saying, here, look, difficult word, here are some synonyms, this is the samasa, it breaks up like this. And so it was all happening in very much in my life. And when I would look up these words, there had been this incredible 150 or 200 years of discovery of these shared Indo-European origins, and it was like it was a sort of shared history of sound and meaning. And this book, as you know, in some ways is so anxious about language, so anxious about English. And suddenly, when the story of Sanskrit started to unfold, and the connection with Greek and Latin, it was not so difficult for me to be an English writer anymore. Suddenly, I thought,
you had a shared past.
I didn't feel like, that sense of impoverishment that you grow up with in India. It helped me, it mitigated that in some ways. And I think that excitement just kind of, it sort of bled into the book. I mean, I had to be careful because I kept looking to that excitement for, it was almost the source of the passion, the excitement for the language, and I had to be careful that it didn't hijack my novel,
It doesn't. It actually makes it really very interesting. Can I request you read that bit where there are an entire conversation? It's between, is it between Toby and Uma, or is it between Skanda and Gauri?
Yeah, it's between Skanda and Gauri.
And if you'd just like to put the context of when that scene happens.
So this is like right in the beginning of the 1984 section, which, as I said to you, is a section enfolded by this feeling of night, and it's a very, very dark, difficult section, and and this is a slightly playful moment in it, right in the beginning. And for some reason, I can't find it for the life of me. Is it? Ah, yeah. Thank you. So, breathing in the thick night air and letting her teeth chatter for effect, she says, "What a night." She draws him close to her and seeming now to want his attention, says, "How do you say night in Sanskrit, baby?" "Ratri, of course," he says easily. "And yes, of course." Yes, of course. Then half teasing, half humoring him, she says, "And does it have any cognates?" She turns away, missing the smile her question brings to his face. The cognate game, introduced to him by his father, and something of a joke between him and Mackinson, has in the 6 months Skanda and Gauri have been together, been appropriated by them. Making fun of me or what? No, truly, I want to know. Well, the answer is no. No cognates. How boring. Baby, what? Baby, he says, now wrapping his arms around her. What? She says, embarrassed. Any cognates, I love you. Shut up, fool. No cognates for Ratri. But I might be able to rustle some up for Nakta. Nakta, she repeats carefully. Is that night too? Yes. A long, dark, nocturnal thread. Go on. Well, on one condition. What? A kiss for everyone. Silly fool. Agreed? Agreed. Nox. Oof, I knew that. A grudging peck. Nux. Again? No. Nox Latin, Nux Greek. Oh, fishy, but okay. A taught and withheld one. Have a good day at the office kind of thing. Then? Nachturu. Eeks. What is that, German? Zenda Westen. Oh, baby, come here. You're so sexy. A real kiss, something long and ponderous. Go on. Nacht. What, bloody cheat, making a fool of me? No kiss, a shove instead. No, I promise this is the German, he says, extracting his due. The next one better be wildly different. Naktis, he says sibilantly into the night air, seeming now not even to want to kiss. Oh, what is that? Lithuanian, my love, he says airily. Come here, little bugger. And she gives him a kiss that's like a spanking. And we may already be at the end of the thread. Oh, that's not impressive. Nuts. What is that? Gothic. And now she takes his face in her two hands and gives him the best kiss of the night. Still being kissed, he murmurs, "Niet, niet." What she mumbles with her mouth full? Anglo-Saxon, he mumbles back, and the kiss deepens. Any more? Noshti, Slavic. Not cheating, I hope. No, gory, deep, all-enveloping night. Finnegan's night, the dark night of the soul, where under the cover of fog and darkness, we enter the shell of this house together. Look, he says, and points to the light in the portico of the house. A few naked bulbs extend from long wires. They reveal a construction site of sorts, and hanging from a line, the frayed vests and paint-spattered trousers of laborers. Inside, yes. We have to find this party.
Living the life you live in Delhi, which is part of a sort of privileged elite, are you getting away with all the mentions that you made to all the famous people? For
No,
me,
I'm suffering
it was a bit
terribly.
like, where's Waldo? You know, I was like, oh, this character, it's definitely Geeta Mehta. This character, this must be Vasundhara Raje.
And you're just
You know, it
you're
was
taking
like
this
amazing.
conversation in a dangerous direction.
But I mean, it's so obvious. You can't miss it. And anybody who's lived in Delhi is obviously going to pick it up.
Yeah, but
Are you going to be invited to any more drawing room cocktails after this book?
maybe not. You know, it's, I'm willing to laugh with you about it, but actually, like, you know, these characters, there are some people who, you're right, seem like they have direct models, but you take, firstly, this was my real material. This was the world that none of these people were there. They were not sort of brought in as scaffolding. They were there as part of this world. And it was once the character makes them or takes that transition into that fictional circle, they really become appropriated by the novel. And I've long ago stopped thinking of the real people that inspired those characters. Maybe no more parties. Maybe you're right.
What is your writing schedule like? Do you sit down and write when you work on a novel of this size, sort of every day in the morning, all day through, or you sort of retire, you do it in bits and pieces? How does it all come together? Because it's not a short piece of work.
For this novel, most of the time, I would wake up around between 4 and 5 and work till about 10. And then I would, and this is not uninterrupted work. I would do other things in the meantime. I like to smoke cigarettes perhaps and drink coffee and eat toasts and things like that. And then by 10 o'clock, if I'd done my work, I was usually really tired and would do some kind of pretty heavy exercise. And then the real business for the rest of the day was, which I think is the thing that makes prose narrative probably the hardest, is that business of really like kind of living with a narrative. And what you should try to, I feel what I had to do was to try to make sure that the fore of my mind was quite empty, and a lot of things that I would rather like to do, like have a dinner party with friends that goes on till about 1 o'clock. If you do that, then there's a little bit of your novel that works away in the back of your head that doesn't happen if you bring in the distractions. So it was a game of trying to actually leave yourself empty. And if you left yourself empty enough, you could hope that the next day a little bit of your work had been done for you.
And having said that, did these characters develop fully before you set them on paper, or did they develop as you wrote the novel? Because they're very complex characters, very layered.
I'm trying to answer this question in a way that doesn't actually falsify the process. I think that there would have been certainly a seed of a character. You can't begin anything like this without that. That would have been, there's quite a lot of discovering one's character. You know, in the first bit, there's a very strong image. In this case, the image of a young man bringing his father back to this town to be cremated. And suddenly, as I started to discover the relationship that these characters have to each other, I was able to understand certain tensions, certain weaknesses in the character, certain quality. There was an element of surprise that I was actually looking for, and that probably should be there. Because if the business of writing happens too much in advance, then it's a little bit inert on the page. I hope that doesn't sound too involved.
No, it doesn't, because one of the next question I was going to ask you about is that I was deeply moved by your perception of the detail in the way in which the characters respond to each other. In fact, in the way the relationships between the characters. And they're very real, they're very human. Earlier in the morning in the session, you were talking on literature and journalism. You could tell that these are emotions or people that have been known very closely to see that intimacy of detail. And that's where I was sort of leading to.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, it would come from just concentration and from making sure you're with the material for long enough, you know? There's no trick except that.
I'm going to go back to identity. Yours is a sort of hybrid identity, you know, with your parentage, you're growing up. Do you see yourself as a global citizen? One of the things that this book talks about is, you know, the whole Hindu business later when Mani Raja wants all the villages to learn Sanskrit because he thinks this is what it's all about. Yeah, he's completely mad. But he's also quite well sketched. I mean, he's very...
There's something sexy and vital about him.
Yeah, that whole thing, that is what it is. This is one word for Mani Raja, it's vitality, which is one of the attractions for Uma.
Yeah.
But having said that, you know, all of this, that balance, and also earlier I have an image from your Stranger in History about your going into Mecca with your Krishna tattoo.
Yeah.
How does all of this come together for Atish the writer versus Atish the person?
Well, I think that if I had to look at it like that, I would probably have some kind of breakdown. But you don't, that never is how anybody's life feels, you know? You never like sit down and think like, you never try to, I mean, I think that the business of trying to put together experience, of trying to make a whole of one's experience of it, it wouldn't happen by forming some large category that would comfort you. It would happen just by realizing that perhaps you do work in different places and you move easily between places and you start to understand, like, you start to develop certain interests. You live close to the ground, you know, you don't, I feel like when I get asked this question, it never feels like life, that question. You know, I don't think that anybody goes home at night and says like, you know.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll take that as an answer.
It's a truthful answer.
Fair enough. There's that wonderful bit which is one of my favorites, and if you'll share that with the audience, the one where Skanda meets his aunt after many years on a drunken evening party, and their sort of interaction, because she hasn't seen him for like over, what, 20 years?
I'm just...
Skanda's mother and his aunt have not been close for many years. He's come back to India and he lands up at a party at her house, which is a very wild party, and he doesn't recognize his Masi for a while because she is suffering from cancer and chemo, so she's under a turban. But eventually they meet at the party, and this is the bit after where she's overwhelmed and he's kind of still not sure about his emotions and the past that she brings up.
Okay. A very different kind of party is in progress upstairs. Younger, looser, but more adult somehow. In a line of long, thin-paned windows, clusters of dark mango leaves are visible, their veins gilded with streetlight. Pinkish halogen light burns behind a bar of glass shelves. Their shadowy reflection blazes dimly in the brass studs lining the green leather arms of a sofa. From the pool table at the center of the room, the low murmur of voices spills over like mist off a stage. The room is a holding pen for other rooms, for terraces and balconies, for bathrooms. And it is here in this place so thickly absorbed in the present that Isha, a half-crazed Katerina Ivanovna, comes hunting about for the past. Her arrival causes some little stir. It feels as if friends and wives have been quick to spread the word to the brothers hosting the party, Iqbal and Farid, that their mother has broken bounds. One senses she has done this before. chosen a night like tonight, when hope is high and the memory of bad times more distant than ever, to resurrect the deadest of dead pasts. She comes with Skanda and Gauri, following somewhat brazenly into the room, and makes straight for a table near the sofa. After groping about in the darkness for a moment, she turns on a switch, and a bright pool of light falls over a table with many framed photographs. The light coming on like that in the dark room gives people a shock, and they recoil, as if only now certain of a rumor that has been doing the rounds in the darkness. A few prettily made-up girls sitting on the sofa smile nervously. Isha, oblivious to the reaction in the room, runs her finger over one picture with a silver frame. Skanda and Gauri, believing perhaps that it is the picture that she has brought them up to show them, draw nearer, but they soon see that it is someone else. A black and white picture of a very beautiful woman with a boy. She has a heart-shaped face, a deep widow's peak, and dark lips and eyes full of laughter. She is dressed in what looks like a maroon or red salwar kameez, cut squarely at the neck. A chiffon dupatta hangs lightly off the springy mass of her hair. She stands behind a sofa, leaning over the boy, who is in school uniform with his long hair in plaits and white ribbons. He holds a school book in his hand, but looks adoringly up at his mother. Gazing at the picture, half tenderly it seems, Isha murmurs, "Bitch." Then she turns to the sofa where the girls sit. Her eye, trailing its length, rests on the girls whose faces are buoyant with collagen, their lips glossy, their cleavages deep and draped in chiffon. Her gaze sharpens, seems even to burn slightly. She considers them as if they are a stain on the leather. Then finally, when they do not get the message and smile nervously back up at her, ever more lethal eyes, she says, "Get up, let an old woman rest her bones." The girls' gelatin lips part in a white-toothed smiles of apology. They slide down the sofa, forcing one of their flock to rise. She stands by the arm, uneasily surveying the scene in the room. Soon the one nearest to her rises too, sending a seesaw of nerves sliding down upon the one who remains sitting. The two who are standing conveniently see someone they know by the bar and take flight. This is too much for the one who remains. She gives Isha, who has just sat down heavily next to her, a frightened look, a plea for understanding, and flees herself, leaving the sofa empty. "Ha," Isha says, "we soon saw them off, the little sluts. Come sit down and tell me, where was I?" Before they can answer, she turns her eyes with their blank and loveless gaze to the picture which is in her lap now. I'm going to skip slightly ahead. So she says then, they're talking about, oh wait, they're talking about 1984, and Skanda asks, "During the riots, were we staying with you?" She says, "No, no one was there. I mean, people were there, but not us. It had become a fortress, the house." "No, you weren't there, not in 84. Why did you ask that?" "You were there a lot, though, for endless holies and Diwalis, there when your whiskey Masterji and me had one of our big violent fights." "Swine," she says with casual rancor, as if returned to the emotion of that night. "He broke my nose. Do you remember that? I came running into yours and Farid's room bleeding, and whiskey, he was ready to beat me some more. And for what? Because I called her mother a whore? So, she was a whore." She laughs out loud, a terrible laugh. "I met your mother soon after it happened. She came to see me. It was just before we all went to Gulmarg for the summer. And she said," whiskey must have gone whining to her, "Ish, did you call his mother, late mother, she just died, a whore?" I said I did. "So?" "He called our mother a whore too." And your mother, she used to be so funny, Skandu. Instead of showing concern for her poor sister still licking her wounds, she said, "Ish, what does it matter if he called Mama a whore? Mama, who's lived such a dreary life, she would probably be delighted if she knew someone had called her a whore. His mother, on the other hand, God rest her soul, slept with half the Punjab. You can't go about with her ashes hardly cold calling her a whore." Isha laughs uproariously and lights a cigarette. Then catching the bearer's eye behind the bar, she tinkles the ice in her glass and mouths, "Drink, lao, fatso." Her mind, though in some ways puddled with alcohol, is in other ways flexible and capacious, able to keep many windows open at once, able to form surprising connections. She now says, "But your mother, Skandu, was not like Whiskey's mother, who, though brave and beautiful and glamorous, was at the end of the day a fool. Her motivations were the motivations of a fool: lust, money, power. Your mother, though at times she chased these things too, chased them for different reasons. She had such a romance in her mind about her life. She had such a, I read this phrase once in a novel, must have been Dickens or Thackeray, James perhaps, a talent for life. Is it James, Wings of the Dove? He doesn't know, but he is deeply impressed. This generation, he thinks, this last little trace of colonial education in India, they are not so bad after all. They're on their way out now, and when they're gone, no one will remember in the world opening up of collagen lips and blue glass malls that there were once these people, these women who, drunk and angry and bitter about life, could nonetheless, from the depths of some quieter India, where afternoons were longer and reading deeper, throw a little Henry James your way on a cold December night as easily as someone passing over a bowl of peanuts.
It's beautiful. Thank you. Can we now take questions from the audience?
Sure.
Yes, please.
But wasn't it more Rajiv Gandhi's political goons and gundas who had orchestrated it? Or do you think at a much, much lower level it was this kind of religious attacks by the Hindus against the Sikhs?
Oh no, I think that it was an orchestrated riot. I absolutely think that. Is that what you're asking me? Do you feel that, was it spontaneous violence?
Yeah, no, because I thought you did use the word Hindus attacks against the Sikhs.
Oh, well, I mean, it was certainly like, I was in a Sikh family and there was definitely the feeling, and it ran very deep because there was this sense that had been in the north of the Sikhs being the sword arm of Sikhism and of Sikhs having defended India many times, and for them, there was very much the sense of being attacked by Hindus. And so it wasn't, I mean, even though they knew that the Congress had a hand in it and the Congress had, like in some ways, certainly enabled it, I think there was definitely, it definitely felt like a religious attack as well. And for years, that tension remained. For years, even during the Rajiv Gandhi campaign, there were pictures of Sikhs put up, and they would say, do you trust this man? You know, so it was a long, in fact, it's very funny, the way people talk a lot about Muslims and Islam now, it was very similar to the way people spoke about Sikhs. In fact,
there are portions in the book that talk about that and the way the characters deal with that. The sort of Sikh pride, their anger at what the Hindus do to them. You know, they're connecting with the Islam, and I mean, it's a very interesting if you read the book.
In 84?
In October.
It's a kind of a funny story. So in the same days when my first sentence was Indira Gandhi, hi, hi, I was also living with my mother in a Barsati in Golf Links. And she'd been sent to cover the riots. And the Sunday Times, let me get this right. The Sunday Times had said to her, when Mrs. Gandhi was killed, to go to Amritsar. And she'd felt that nothing was going to happen in Amritsar and she should stay in Delhi, but they insisted. So she went to Amritsar. And when the riots broke out, I was basically on my own with someone taking care of me, and she tried to tell my grandmother to take me, and my grandmother had said, I know this country, take my word for it, there'll be no violence. And so one of my earliest memories is actually of being in this situation where the riots had begun and then having to be ferried across to the house of
How
family.
old were you then?
I was 4.
You didn't have hands.
So, like a Judah and things? No, never. No.
Must still be pretty unnerving.
Yeah, it was unnerving. I remember I walked in to my grandparents' house where they'd actually broken, a Christian neighbor had broken the nameplate. It was a glass nameplate. And my grandfather was sitting there with a gun across his lap, you know, like thinking that we left in 1947 and we're not going to leave again, you know. So it was very, very, there was no, I mean, so often in India a riot has a class angle, whereas the Sikh riots, it seemed, it didn't matter if you were privileged, you were not insulated from the violence. In fact, many people, I know many people who were directly affected by the violence at that time.
Any other questions?
You spoke about how when you sent a draft of your book to your father, he sent you an enraged email. I want you to speak a little about how you reacted to that email. You said you just rediscovered him. So did it sort of discourage you? It obviously hasn't because you've continued to write. But what was your immediate response to such an email from your father, who you recently rediscovered? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're right. I think that there was a certain curiosity that came later, but at the time it was very defensive, my reaction. I'd made a lot of effort my father was in a sense a discovery. He was someone I met for the first time in my early 20s. We'd kind of cobbled together this little relationship, and suddenly I was caught completely off guard by the force of his reaction. I also didn't understand it. I didn't understand how someone who was irreligious could still be upset as a Muslim. You know, and Stranger to History was in a sense trying to work out the confusion of that.
If there are, is there one more question? Go ahead.
In the present scenario of like hostility against movies and literary works, how did you juggle through the most controversial incidents that rocked the country almost, like the Sikh riots and all the things? And how did you juggle through when you worked out in your book?
I didn't fully hear the question.
Yeah, I didn't get what you are trying to ask.
No. In these days where movies and literary works, attract the hostility of the masses, when they speak something about the controversial incidents, how did you juggle through the Sikh riots and the incidents?
He just explained he was 4 years old during the Sikh riots.
No, during the Sikh riots, I was only 4.
When you wrote the book, how did you juggle through this? Did you expect any kind of like hostility from?
Did you expect some kind of reaction?
Has a backlash to my book?
Backlash?
Yeah.
Okay.
Nothing so far.
There's one lady, somebody in the back.
A journalist who covers, say for example, conflicts.
Sorry,
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
No.
If a journalist is covering a conflict, communal, and if the journalist also happens to be close to the political elite, do you think the journalist should try to influence decisions?
A journalist close to the political elite covering riots, should they influence the political elite? You haven't been in that space.
Yeah, I haven't been in it's funny, I think that probably in 1984, certain people did try to influence the Rajiv Gandhi government, and many people went and with begging him to send the army out, and he wouldn't do it. So I don't think it matters. I mean, when a politician is behaving like that in a fairly calculated way, probably it doesn't make a difference what someone will come and say to him.
Can we finish off the session by you explaining to me and the audience the way you came to the title and what it comes from?
So it was a little bit of a gift, the title. I had, which I'll never tell you, I had a working title that was pretty atrocious. And then I stumbled upon one of the translations for Itihasa, which is a samasa, it's a compound, was narratives of the way things were. And so I discarded the narratives and used this title, which is really a reasonable translation of the Sanskrit word for history. And history is a big theme in the novel, so that's how it came about.
So please make sure that you buy a copy while Atish is here and get him to sign it for you. Thank you very much for a lovely sharing of your work.
Thank
you all for being here. Thank you.